Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 28th of February 2025. Quite a lot to get through in terms of the military aid, and there's also going to be a little extra bit at the end where I'm going to dip into Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell talking about UK defence and can it be independent from the US, and what the issues there are. Fascinating discussion. I think I'm going to play you like a 7-minute clip, so it will be 7 minutes longer than it normally would be, but that's really pertinent to anyone who's interested in European. That's not just pertaining to the UK, it's actually a general statement about European, the independence or the possibility of an independent European defence sector when we're technologically dependent on the US. Fascinating discussion. We'll get to that at the end. Right, we're going to start with Mark Rutte, who has announced that NATO allies will provide Ukraine with billions more in aid. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said yesterday that alliance members are ramping up their defence investments and preparing additional financial support for Ukraine. There is a mobilisation within Europe in terms of support for Ukraine, but also getting ready to spend an awful lot more on defence. And I think there's a desire, as you would expect, to have that being beneficial for each country, not just in terms of national security, but also in terms of industry and economics. There's a lot of expenditure going on there, and people will want some return on investment, economically speaking, too. So I think people are going to be investing in their own industrial base. And again, that's pertinent to the discussion we're going to have later. Right, European officials are racing to craft proposals for a special fund aimed at helping the region to boost defence investments after Trump threatened to curtail US support for the continent, according to the Financial Times. And that is all part of what we're just talking about as well. European finance ministers are meeting in South Africa for a G20 gathering this week. They are discussing proposals including a European defence bank or a common fund with UK involvement as well, because obviously we're not in the EU. So keep your eyes peeled for more information on that. A European defence organisation will be the only possible solution, says Francois Bayrou, the Prime Minister of France. So you got the President being Emmanuel Macron, the Prime Minister there. In an interview with Le Figaro said, "You have heard the future." German Chancellor make remarks that could never have been imagined, mentioning French and British nuclear protection for Germany. France, since de Gaulle, was right to think that there is no guarantee, including European, except in independence. He added that the question of Ukraine is Europe's to be or not to be its point of truth. A really important decisions coming up about the future of Europe, about the relationship with each member country of the EU, that interrelationship in terms of both international security and economics and industry in terms of the defense military industrial base in these nations and spreading out around Europe and trying to get away from the US, but also built into that is the revisited idea of having a European army. And the French have always been a big proponent of that idea. And here you see the Prime Minister repeating that. But I think it's gaining an awful lot of traction these days. Because at the end of the day, when you're a tiny country, you don't want to be doing everything. Having all your own air defence, air force, navy, army. You're a country of 1 million. So what you need to do is, right, we'll specialise in this if you guys specialise in that. So you'll provide our navy for us while we're doing, I don't know, IT or Air Force or whatever. That allows smaller countries to be able to have their own defence. I think Perrin did a really interesting video on this like 2 years ago about how smaller countries do defence strategies. And it's going to look very different from, say, the United States. And that's the importance of alliances, right? That's how NATO kind of works. And I think one of the most viable solutions to these almost 30 countries hanging out together is that they do share the defence burden. And that allows for specialisation and a more efficient use of resources. But it's not to everyone's taste, right? Now, the Ministry of Defence are being quite strong. This is this is an important statement, and this is on the back. Bear in mind, this comes from the 27th of February and would have taken some time to put together because he's been to all of those countries, right? As you'll see in a minute. So this is the Armed Forces Minister Luke Pollard for the UK government going around Europe, drumming up support for Ukraine. This is a response to the rhetoric that has been coming from the US, where we're seeing this divergence. Interestingly, I think Keir Starmer last night did quite a good job of bringing the US back into the fold a little bit. Or maybe you could argue the other way, bringing the UK and by extension possibly Europe back into the fold of the US a little bit. So, you know, it was going like that, and now it's a bit like that. But there are some massive decisions to be made. So the UK, in the UK is going to be hosting a big meeting with Zelensky and European leaders on the 2nd of March. I think there's another meeting on the 6th of March. That's going to be deciding on whether Europe does that. There's an awful lot of strategizing to be done. And so this kind of rhetoric is very interesting. It's important for Ukraine. And it's a statement to the United States.
5 countries, 2 days, one clear message. The United Kingdom is stepping up our support for Ukraine, and I've been speaking to colleagues right around Europe about how we can do that together. I'm in Vilnius in Lithuania, in Finland today, back in Copenhagen, Eindhoven in the Netherlands, Riga in Latvia now. The UK will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. The world has changed a lot in only a few weeks. That's why I've visited some of our closest European allies to discuss going even further in our support for Ukraine. It's good that there's talk about peace, but we can't jeopardise the peace by forgetting about the war. The fight is not over, and the UK is committed to driving forward unified support for Ukraine. And to be here on the day where the Prime Minister has announced an increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by April 2027 and 3% in the next Parliament helps underline how the UK is stepping up our commitment.
Okay, so that's a bit of PR for the UK government, but it's about being very strong on the rhetoric for support for Ukraine and also the seriousness of ramping up defence spending in the UK and working very closely. The important part there is working very closely with European partners. And again, that goes back to everything we've just been saying. Now, at the same time, talking about this divergence, you've got an exclusive in the Times. I'm trying to get yes, I've got an archived version of that. The US government officials are warning behind the scenes that the UK should move away from buying American equipment. So the US armed forces the US government officials, are very cognizant of the problematic positioning the US has taken in the last month. Everything's changed in the last month, where it looks like the US is now the enemy of Ukraine. Again, last 24 hours might have changed things a little bit. But where we've seen the US at least be, therefore, unreliable, inconsistent, and kind of all over the shop. And if that's the case, is it safe for both the Europe and the UK to rely on defense manufacturers in the US, even though they've got like the best kit in certain domains, if there are going to be reliances on the US and the US could just turn on a sixpence? And if they hold kill switches to particular pieces of equipment, then it renders that equipment somewhat impotent. So in this Times piece, the MOD makes a kit wish list after a £6 billion increase in defence spendings, but officials have been advised by US insiders to reduce Britain's reliance on American equipment. Fascinating, because Americans wouldn't say that unless they were worried about the more abstract issues here of cooperation and defence. Like, Americans are going to be saying all the time, buy our stuff, buy our stuff, buy our stuff, until you reach a point where, like, people in that government are going to be, I think we might be the bad guys now. Don't tell anyone, but probably don't buy our stuff. That is an incredibly important pivot and a reflection of that pivot, and an important thing for these guys to supposedly have said. So as the MOD works out how best to spend its extra money, US government officials are warning behind the scenes that the UK should move away from buying American equipment. A British defence figure who's not part of the government was told privately by US officials that it should recalibrate its reliance on US equipment. This was after suggestions were allegedly raised within the Trump administration that the UK was getting equipment too cheaply. A British defence figure privy to the discussion said. Recounting the conversation in recent weeks, the source said, they said we shouldn't be buying US equipment, and there was a feeling in the US administration that they should be sending the UK a bill because they have got defence equipment cheaply. The UK, that is. The source added, some think the UK got an unfairly cheap deal with Trident. I mean, Trident is our new nuclear deterrent that is coming in at a massive cost, and that's why people are saying, really, is there any point spending that much money? But now people are going, oh, nukes are pretty important, but actually having renewed ones, will it, you know, is it necessary? But then other people are then coming back and saying, well, if we can cancel that order or that project now, let's do it, because actually it might be worth having our own independent nukes like France have. So we have this technological maintenance dependence on the US. Then they can start commanding higher prices to us, and then we're, as mentioned, technologically and potentially operationally reliant on the US. And if they end up being the bad guys, for example, then that compromises our nuclear deterrent. American officials said the UK and others should not assume that they can ride out a Trump presidency because JD Vance, the vice president, could succeed him. Quote, we've been trying to tell people to recalibrate. The old certainties are gone, the officials told the defence expert, who is not a member of the UK government, as mentioned. They said that a US administration could put restrictions on kit from the US, and that if countries are deemed not to be doing what you were told, you will suddenly find out missiles won't fire and planes won't fly. You have got to be careful. The source said this is a transactional side of Trump. Details of the conversation emerged as ministers, defence chiefs and experts work out the priorities for the MOD and the publication of the Strategic Defence Review. That's now going to have to change, and we've heard that the Strategic Defence Review, which was already going to be really importantly changing direction because of the war in Ukraine, but now they're having to go back somewhat to the drawing board to say, hang on, we might need to change the whole strategic review because it turns out the US has pivoted. And if the US has pivoted, we need to review exactly what we need from our defence and what we need from our procurement and defence industrial base. And do we then work closer with Europe and move away from the US? So we will return to this idea later because, you know, there's an awful lot of money that needs to be spent. And yeah, it's so here's one former senior defence source said that the problems with ammunition were severe. All of Britain's AS-90 155mm self-propelled howitzers were handed over to the Ukrainians, and although the army has since procured 24 Archer artillery systems from Sweden, this was a temporary solution. Under current plans, the army will get the German RCH 155mm artillery system in 2032 as a long-term replacement. But Sir General Rowley Walker, the Chief of General Staff, believes that should happen sooner if funds are available. So, you know, there's lots of decisions to be made. Interesting article there in the Times. Right, we're going to go on, but return to that right at the end. Finnish MOD is launching a new programme to support Ukraine, focused on orders from its own military-industrial complex. This is what I was talking about at the beginning. Yep, we're going to help Ukraine, but there has to be investment going inwardly, and that's completely understandable. No such thing as a free lunch. The government is expected to allocate 660 million euros, which will be used to purchase weapons from the Finnish military-industrial complex and transfer them to Ukraine. And Finland's able to do that in a way that, say, Denmark is less able to do that because there is munition production that the Finnish are involved in, etc., etc. Swedish financed and Swedish built gas turbines soon on their way to Ukraine. Again, industrial stimulus. Last autumn, the government decided on 500 million Swedish krona to support for 2 large gas turbines in support. Each turbine can generate electricity for 185,000 people. Now the gas turbines will soon be ready for delivery. Excellent news there. And we go on. French Aid Ukraine reports that, actually this should have come earlier, that gas one should have come in my humanitarian bit in a little while. The delivery of the first French Mirage 2000-5F to Ukraine went well, and others will follow. The pilots and mechanics have been well trained. They are now helping to defend the skies over Ukraine, said the Chief of Air Force Staff for the French. We have to modernise our surface-to-air defence by 2027. We will begin replacing the 8 SAMP-T systems with 8 new generation SAMP-T NG systems. These are ones that are better able, I believe, to take out ballistic missiles. These new systems will allow us to significantly increase our engagement ranges, thanks to a new radar. What else? One comment, it was likely an air transfer. The Mirage 2005Fs took off from NATO territory and flew directly into Ukraine. They might well have had more Mirages then. Interesting. Okay, Ukraine is scaling up domestic fiber optics. SSO has tested Ukrainian-made silkworm fiber optic modules. They can be installed not only on FPV drones, but also ground robotic systems and used to control surface and underwater drones. FPV drones equipped with silkworm can operate over 20-kilometer distances. So that's good. There's a lot of work going into fiber optics that are resistant to electronic warfare interference. NASAM, so the Norwegian and the American co-produced air defense missile manufacturer. Well, actually, okay. So the manufacturer of this, which is probably Kongsberg, which is Norwegian. They are opening a company in Ukraine. Quote, in the long term, when the war is over, Ukraine could become part of the missile supply chain for the air defense system, said the president of the company. And that's good news there. Investing in Ukraine, but also giving them the ability to be in control of their own production of really important equipment. Ukraine is to receive $730 million for demining equipment by partners by 2034. So it's not just like this year, that's up until 2034. Total of 51 million euros, $53 million has already been raised, and said Ruslan Berulia, the head of the Mine Action Department. Good news there. Then we hear that Australian philanthropists donate $3.15 million to Ukraine and urge governments to step up support. This is the Minderoo Foundation, which is I think it's Andrew Forrest, who's previously been a big supporter of Ukraine. Not everyone likes Andrew Forrest. I think he's a bit controversial, but he's a stalwart supporter of Ukraine. And Ukrainian communities impacted by the Russian aggression will receive money from this foundation. $3.15 million is really helpful. Excellent stuff. Okay, Japan will provide Ukraine with another grant of $58 million to be used particularly for humanitarian, demining, energy, water supply, education, public health and security matters. Good stuff there. Now moving on to troops. Albania has become the 13th country to join the Interflex initiative for training Ukrainian military personnel that is set up in the UK, but it's delivered by, as you can see, all these nations: Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Kosovo, Australia, Canada, Albania, Finland, Romania, Denmark, New Zealand, Lithuania and Estonia, all involved with the UK in delivering training for Ukrainian soldiers. And I know the UK also, I think, trains special forces, Marines as well in the UK. Mobilising youth is Kiev's only chance to counter Trump's bad deal, says The Economist. Ukraine needs to expand mobilisation to stay in the fight against at least 1 million Russian soldiers. The contract for volunteers aged 18 to 24 aims to attract 4,000 recruits each month. There was a text message I saw that's gone out to 18 to 24-year-olds that's trying to really attract them to voluntarily join. They don't want to do a kind of forced mobilisation. They're trying to voluntarily attract these people by giving them, free education, further education, or I think maybe vocational education, either or, something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. They also want to attract people back to Ukraine, but it's not controversial. It's a dilemma because there's an absolute demographic black hole, and it's really been illustrated this week with the predictions of the population size in both sort of 2030 and by 2100 it will have a population 25 million, something like that. Or was it even less than that? And maybe it's like 2030, it's 25 million. The population is in trouble. And of course, your economy functions better with more people because you get more tax dollars and you get economies of scale, etc., etc. It is, Ukraine is facing a real challenge because they need more people to join the army, but then those people die, or they're taken away from the economy, or they're injured, and then they become all of them, whether they're fighting alive or dead, and you're paying compensation, become, and I mean this just economically, a drain on the government, on the budget, on the treasury, because you're taking people often from private jobs who are paying taxes and you're moving them to the public sector where you're paying them wages. And so that already you're losing out there. So that becomes really expensive. And then if they die, you're paying compensation. If they're injured, then you're paying them compensation and then probably a pension. And if they're alive, you're paying them a wage. And all of that costs, and they're not in the private sector's earning money and then spending that money, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is difficult in terms of being at war and trying to get an army to defend a nation while keeping the nation functioning economically. Because if it stops functioning economically, then what are you fighting for? The nation falls apart. That's the dilemma they face. And the demographics are looking terrible for 18 to 24-year-olds. And the birth rates are terrible. And those are the people most likely to have babies. So you send them off to war, they're not going to have babies. And the birth rate is already the worst in, I think, the world. So the Ukrainian birth rate is, I'm pretty sure it's the worst in the world. Turkey is considering sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, according to Bloomberg. That's interesting. They're coming on board more, I think, formally. Turkey has indicated its openness to deploying troops in Ukraine as part of the potential peacekeeping force, says Bloomberg yesterday, citing forces familiar with the matter. Ireland is ready to send peacekeepers as well to Ukraine, according to the Irish Prime Minister, to President Zelensky, as Zelensky visited the Taoiseach, the Irish leader, yesterday on the way to the US. He's obviously in the US today to speak to Trump to sign the minerals deal. So Ireland going to participate there. If you want to know about Irish peacekeepers, there's what was once an infamous story. It's actually an amazing story of the Irish peacekeepers, and it was infamous because they kind of had to surrender in the end, but it was an absolutely epic tale of heroism. If you see, is it Stephen Dornan in Siege of Jadotville, a very good film. Go and watch it on Netflix. So if you've got Netflix, it's free for you to watch. Well, not free, but you pay for Netflix. But Siege of Jadotville, and it's the Irish peacekeepers in, I think, the 1960s in Central Africa, doing a peacekeeping mission, and they were surrounded and sieged. And it was, very good story. But anyway, Irish there involved. Answering a question about whether he would be ready to provide air cover and support for European troops in Ukraine, Trump said that an economic agreement with Ukraine will indeed bring us into that country. We will work there. And in that sense, it's very good. It is support. This is the worry about the kind of backstop, the American backstop, is that... So Starmer went to White House, and I think one of his intentions would have been to ensure a backstop is provided by the US for peacekeeping troops from Europe that would be sent to Ukraine. If we don't have the support, particularly air support, radar support, all that kind of stuff, then it becomes very difficult for the Europeans because they don't have the capacity to do that, maybe even the capabilities at all, or at least largely. The US is vital for a peacekeeping force, but the problem is Starmer was never really going to get that formally agreed upon. I think that was just a step too far. But Trump did say, we are, he implied, as you can see here, that the US will be in support of those peacekeeping troops because there'll be workers in Ukraine, and they're not going to attack Americans, and so therefore that will be part of the security guarantees. But it's a little bit sort of vague and hopeful, I think. Now, Trump answered the question whether he would help the UK if it was attacked. British troops can take care of themselves, but if they need help, I will always be with the British. So that's, no, they don't really need our help, but I guess in a real desperate situation, we might come to help them. Probably come to help them. So make of that what you will. Here's another little excerpt
between our two countries. That is why this is the greatest alliance for prosperity and security I think the world has ever seen. Whenever necessary, we absolutely backed each other up, and that's at the core.
Could you take on Russia by yourselves?
Well,
all right, one or two more. Yes.
So that's Trump asking, and that's a difficult question, Starmer, whether he could take on Russia by themselves. As Jimmy Russian says, security expert, there's actually no correct answer to this question. If Russia attempted to invade the UK, Russia would lose badly. But if the UK attempted to fight the Russian army on the continent, the UK would also lose badly. Conflict is not simply about sheer numbers and never has been. And actually, so if the UK put all of its efforts into supporting Ukraine, in Ukraine, for example, then, okay, we've got a fairly small army, but the state that Russia is in at the moment, and our air force, actually, we would give Russia something serious to think about. Of course, then you talk about like a naval battle as well, and then, but it's a bit more nuanced than just saying, could you take on Russia? Like, if we just went to war with Russia now, out the context of this war in Ukraine, then yeah, we wouldn't be able to cope because we don't have the forces, the number of everything that Russia does, or at least did. But now in the context of Ukraine and with Ukraine, that's a different, there's a different answer to that question. So I do get what Jimmy Russian is saying. As Aaron Bastani, who's very, very left-wing, Navarro media, not really supportive of the Ukraine war in a way that I would hope, because I like Aaron Bastani, but I've kind of been a bit not too much in agreement with you these days. Could you take on Russia by yourselves? Starmer's body language is the answer. Yeah, I agree. With beautiful simplicity, Trump highlights something nobody in Europe will openly say, no, we can't. Well, actually, we are saying that as literally the conversation that's going on all the time at the moment. I mean, so I think, it depends who you listen to and who, what the sources you're reading are. But I would say that's exactly why they're meeting on the 2nd of March in Europe, in UK, with European leaders to discuss how do we together, since the UK can't take on Russia on its own and NATO is potentially impotent, what are we doing about that as a European continent with Zelensky as well? Good to see Starmer corrected Trump. And again, this is doing military aid. This is exactly the same issue as Macron had. And he's already corrected Trump on Tuesday, was it? And yet again, we're hearing this. No, Monday, and yet again, we're hearing the same lie, essentially.
We wanted to have a little bit of what the European nations said. They get their money back by giving money. We don't get the money back. Biden made a deal. He put in $350 billion. And I thought it was a very unfair situation.
We're not getting all of ours. I mean, quite a bit of ours was gifted. It was given. There were some loans, but mainly it was gifted, actually.
Actually, I think you're fine. It was mainly gifted, and also he didn't do that, but you could easily call out the 350 billion as well. So good to hear that. Now, German aid to Ukraine has got hold of me to say. The other day, just a bit of a correction. The other day I showed this, and I didn't think it was I didn't think it was correct over here, but it was a useful illustration. It's still a really useful site. Hey mate, just want to let you know that this slide is inaccurate. Military aid by Germany until December 2024 was $15 billion, 14.31 billion euros to be accurate, according to the German government, not the 13.6 billion listed on the website. And it's not, Chancellor Merz isn't the Chancellor until the government has formed, because there are coalition conversations going on. That'll probably happen around April or May. And just to let you know, the 14.31 billion euro figure our government gives, that's without deliveries from the Bundeswehr stocks. So, for example, the 3 Patriot fire units and all the missiles, probably 2 billion euros, are not included, and neither are the Leopard 2A6s, a fair share of the Panzerhaubitze 2000s, and so on. So, real military assistance without the EU share is probably something like $18 billion, and that's substantially different. And the last thing before we get on to just one Russia thing, and then that conversation at the end, 5 former defense secretaries are denouncing President Trump's firing of the Chief Joint's chairman, that's Brown, Charles Brown, and several other senior military officials, urging Congress to hold hearings and declaring they have concluded the officers were fired for purely partisan reasons. So you've got a lot of previous Pentagon leaders coming together, signing a letter to say, what the heck are you doing? This is, it doesn't look good. It looks purely partisan. And actually, that's not good for our national security going forward. And then we hear, and I have reported this previously, but not in a military aid video, the North Koreans have sent 1,000 to 3,000 troops and differing troops as well, not just soldiers, not just infantry's, but also sappers and mechanical equipment operators and whatnot to the Kursk region to bolster the forces, since they've lost 5,000 troops, North Korean troops there already. And that is a massive challenge for the Ukrainians. Now, let's go to this discussion. And, I really appreciate the rest is politics in general. But whenever I exert these clips, please don't think I'm being lazy and sort of I am riding on the shoulders of giants to some degree. But not everyone has the time to watch all of these different videos. I watch a massive bunch of content and I'm forever going, I need to let them know about that. That's brilliant. That's really interesting. And this is one of those discussions that I think it's really useful for you guys to listen to.
Politics question time with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alistair Campbell. Stephen Flatley. Now the United States is not a reliable NATO partner, and we, the UK and Europe, need to take more responsibility for our defence. How much actual operational, technical and political independence do we actually have over our nuclear arsenal? Good question. Jeff, should the UK and European countries impose a war levy on VAT to raise immediate funds for defence? Most people would broadly support this, and it would send a strong signal to Putin. And maybe just throw this one in. You've spoken a lot about the importance of aid. What do you think of aid spending being cut to support defence spending? So there you are, Rory. Kick off with those.
This follows on from yesterday and the big story, which we're all working our way through. Because in 4 weeks, we've had to rethink all our major strategic assumptions. And in some ways, it's daft of us. We should have seen this coming with Trump 1. So we've actually had 8 years to really begin to wake up to the possibility that the US is no longer going to be a predictable, reliable ally, and that the entire rules-based international order that the US created is being abandoned by the US. But it was such a big deal, such a difficult thing to get our heads around, and because, of course, the US has been the largest economy in the world and the largest military in the world for 80 years, and it basically created the UN, created NATO, created the World Bank, that imagining a world without it, I'm still struggling for what exactly the metaphor is. It's more than a foundation stone. It's like, 2/3 the entire building is being removed. We talked in the last podcast about vulnerabilities a little bit, but I guess Stephen Flatley's question gets to that. So let's just start with that and try to understand what the vulnerabilities are and why getting independent from the US is much, much easier said than done. Well, firstly, it's because so much of our kit comes from the US. So enormous amount of our F-35s, for example, which is the attack aircraft we decided to buy, are basically built with some UK components, but basically built in the US. And the Americans, when they sell these things around the world, often demand that they retain the data that these planes pick up. So these planes are full of extraordinary kind of data gathering stuff, but it's all considered top secret. The data is owned by the US. I think at one point we had to negotiate, just shortly after I left government, I think we had to give $400 million to an American defense company to be able to have our own data from our own planes, right? And as the Afghans discovered, if you buy American kit...
Just think about $400 million. We've already bought these planes off you. Can we have the data for the planes, how they're operating, of our own planes? Yeah, you can. $400 million.
You're totally dependent on American contractors to do software updates. And if they don't provide the software updates, the whole stuff is grounded.
Yeah.
So the reason the entire Afghan Air Force and helicopter force collapsed and the Taliban took over the country is American removed all the contractors who were there doing the software upgrades, which have to happen after every mission. Then there's the problem that America retains the right to not deliver stuff. So Sweden had ordered a lot of Patriot missiles, and the United States suddenly said, actually, we can't really afford to give them to you because we want them ourselves for something else, right? This whole world of US defense equipment was not just about the performance of the kit, because sometimes American kit is over-engineered, unbelievably expensive, and has been proved in Ukraine. We're in a world where, in fact, the Ukrainians are showing that you can use $1,000 drones and iPhones to do a lot of the stuff that $150 million planes were doing. One of the reasons we buy the kit is because of security guarantees. So the most extreme example of all is Switzerland buys F-35s. Now, an F-35 is the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, and it's there to do these incredible long-range stealth missions. There is literally no reason for little Switzerland, this neutral mountainous country, to have these planes. The only reason they buy them is that implicit is you buy it and America has your back. Now, America no longer has our back. I think very few people now believe that Trump is going to do anything to defend a European country if it's attacked by Putin. So we then have to think about how we replace all this stuff. Well, you can just about imagine that there could be British, Italian designed planes or French-German designed planes. And in fact, the Typhoon and Rafale can come into that space. There is stuff we can do to replace American anti-aircraft missiles. Rheinmetall is now producing more and more 155mm munition.
Your German pronunciation is coming on, Rory. Well,
thank you very much. Thank you. But we're still dealing with the fact that perhaps our biggest single vulnerability is in tech, because the world of defense is increasingly a world dominated by companies like Palantir and Anduril, SpaceX, and they would say, we've got you over a barrel. So when I meet these people from these American companies, they're like, Europe's finished. You're completely dependent on American tech. The future of the world is American tech, and you can't live without us. And wars are won on the basis of our tech platforms. And of course, the 7 largest tech companies in the world are American. So what would it mean for Europe to actually become independent of Google, independent of the cloud services provided by Microsoft? We have something called SAP, which is incredibly important for running supply chains, but even that lives on cloud computing services provided by these enormous American companies. So there is a double strategy here. There's a strategy about making our own defense equipment and finding markets for our own defense equipment. And then there's an entire strategy about developing a technological infrastructure where, again, we don't really have the finance in place. I mean, famously, we innovate, but we don't produce commercial companies because it's much easier to get funding in the US. There's not a big European market for investing in tech. We don't take risk in the same way that the US does. So tech companies are perpetually flipping over to the US. There are potential companies. There are great German, Swedish, British companies could be building in, but we'd have to completely change our financial infrastructure as well as spending a lot more money. Over to you.
It's partly what they were talking about at the conference in Kyiv, hosted by Zelensky, and a lot of the European leaders were, I mentioned the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen. She was absolutely clear that, Europe has to start to be able to compete on this, because these weren't the words she used, but the notion being that we've just fallen so far behind. And I think the other thing that maybe goes to Stephen's question is so much of our defence budget. So we talk about 2.5%. And I saw Tobias Ellwood, former Tory MP, Defence Select Committee, former soldier, and he was interviewed. He was in Kyiv yesterday. He was saying that the best thing Britain could do as a way of showing leadership to the rest of Europe was actually to say eventually we're going to match America. But of course, to go to one of the other questions in those questions I threw at you at the start, Rory, to spend more on defence means to either grow the economy substantially, which doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon, or make cuts elsewhere. And a lot of people, you and I were both livid that the Americans have sort of basically got rid of USAID, the US Agency for International Development. But now the British government has gone after aid and development as the first thing to go when spending for more defence. So the question there, how do we feel about that? Very, very bad.
Yes. So yes, India's question. Let's get into that for a second.
And then they go on to talk about, the funding of the UK increase in defence expenditure and taking that from foreign aid. But more generally, there are these huge challenges in the European nations becoming independent of the US. in the defence sector, because it actually relies on independence in the tech sector, and that is not very easy, because you just can't be independent. You can't provide those cloud services. You can't provide the technological infrastructure and a foundation for the defence industry, because it's not there, and would require phenomenal investment, and that might take years to develop. So it's easy to, as Rory Stewart said, far easier said than done. It's easy to say, oh yeah, Europe can do this, we can do this alone, but actually, literally, we can't. Certainly not at the moment, and almost certainly for a very, very long time. There will always be some kind of dependence on the US to some degree. And how do we navigate that going forward while demanding at least some greater independence, and being forced into this position of greater independence? So lots of discussion around that. And that means that, as again Stuart said, the US have us over a barrel. There's a huge amount of leverage there. That was fine that leverage was there, because that leverage was never needing to be used, not really in any nefarious way. But now, if we are diverging not just in the military industrial domain, but we're diverging in a geopolitical domain, then if the US have us over a barrel, how does that fit morally and politically with us? You know, being forced to do things that we don't want to do, or being forced not to do things that we do want to do, both as the UK and as European nations. This is going to be a central part of this discussion for the next however many years. You know, if we are now on this path of divorce, how do we solve this issue? How much will it cost? And what are the timeframes involved? Hopefully that's of use to you. Really appreciate feedback about all the topics mentioned today. Don't forget as well that we are still campaigning to get over the line with DZYGA'S Poor, the fundraiser that we're doing at the moment. We are now up to 16,500, so we're just 1,000 away. Remember, if you do press the donate button, go down to the project part here and make sure you click copy ATP for triad comments, and paste that comment into any field or comment section you can find on these payment apps, or on the page here that they provided with a bank card donation. Remember, it's difficult. It doesn't always go through. Payments to Ukraine, it's not Ukraine's fault. It's our banks that don't really like paying Ukraine. I find that PayPal is the most consistently usable method. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, guys, and speak to you soon. And remember, there is a live stream today, UK time, 3:00, with Scott Lucas, and that promises to be fascinating. So please join us for that one. Speak soon.